Okay. 5:30. You good? You good? Great. All right. It's 5:30. So the last panel of a really incredible day. Just a programming note. I was informed that there's going to be a loud stream at 6 p.m. At South Building. Evidently, it's a UNC institution.
It's like a part of their like art day. They do like art throughout the day, arts everywhere. And so I guess screaming is like, you know, the most primal of arts. So that's happening.
Can you scream too?
Oh yeah.
I mean, we can read this as like an expression of angst, anger, or maybe I might even imagine a cathartic celebration for the success of this magical gathering. All right, I'm Daniel Kreiss. I'm one of the principal researchers behind the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. I want to thank again whoever hasn't been here throughout the day, both Felicity and Corbin, for really doing the amazing work of helping us put together what's truly been an extraordinary and generative event. Yeah. As folks know, there are books over in this part of the room. We have Khadija Costley White's wonderful branding of.
It's gone.
Oh, it's
gone.
It's available on your local bookstore, Branding of Right-Wing Activism, by Khadija Costley White, a associate professor at Rutgers. We also have Danica Young's new book, Wrong, which she's going to tell you why she's right in a minute. Francesca Tripodi's amazing propagandist playbook, and of course the Media and January 6th volume, which we are gathered here today to officially launch. First, I just want to thank everyone. I feel like I'm at a wedding. I want to thank everyone who traveled so far to be here. All the contributors to this volume. It really is a great honor to have so many people in the room whose ideas and work I've been engaging with for so many years. I love how in this volume we gathered people at all different stages of their careers. I think they all share a broad normative commitment to multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy here in the US, as well as elsewhere around the world, and who engage with media and power seriously. It has been a wonderful honor to gather together you all as contributors to this volume and think alongside you the last few years that we've been doing this. I also just really want to shout out for a minute, because we didn't get the chance to do this yet, my fellow co-editors on this volume. Khadija Costley White, who you heard from on the last panel, just a note to thank you for your prescient work on the roots of the American reactionary violence that colors our own era. I said this to you privately, I want to say it publicly. Khadija had been thinking about this for a decade before the rest of us got here. I thank you for those contributions. Shannon, my close collaborator, for all of your very close attention to power and really your endless striving to get our public communicators to be better, and your constant interventions in the world in the service of democracy. I appreciate that. And Rebecca, for really leading the charge of accountability, particularly over platforms, both in the US and in Europe, as well as all the ways that they shape our lives. And also a shout out for protecting our country and all the endless service you've done on that front. So I want to give those folks a hand now. All right. In our last panel, I think just real briefly going back to the roots of how this whole project started, which really came together on the first year anniversary of January 6th, 2001, and that it really was a call. It was a call both to understand how fragile multiracial democracy in America is, and how young multiracial democracy in America is. And it was a call to really help us understand and protect this idea, both in our academic fields and in the many industries that we're oriented to, particularly journalism, platforms, social media, technology, the things that as media scholars and communication scholars, we think about on a regular basis, in addition to the political institutions that shape how we contest power in democracies. In this final panel, this is kind of our task, and I couldn't, again, be more honored than to be able to be up here with two friends, and I say that in the truest sense of the word, whose constant wisdom and insights, I think as public scholars, really have helped us understand the life and the times that we're in, as well as the threats and dynamics of not only what we saw on January 6th, but also for understanding contemporary dynamics of power and democracy, and whose undying commitment to public life that both of you share is really an inspiration. So with that, Tressie McMillan-Cotton, who's an associate professor here in the UNC School of Information Library Science, also a CITAP principal investigator. Tressie's work has long been at the forefront of understanding power inequality in media. She's written on economics of higher education, the politics of knowledge, as well as broadly thinking about sort of what is the shape of public life, how is public life monetized in new ways, and how does that give rise to the ways that we can express ourselves as individuals, as citizens, and as political agents and actors. And Danigal Young, who's a professor of communication and political science at the University of Delaware. Danigal is a scholar of political psychology and broadly wrote this amazing new book, which everyone should pick up and order copies for your friends, also at your local bookstore, but really thinking about how dynamics of identity, platforms and media created the context, not just for January 6th, but these intentional dynamics that are shaping our political life and our political communication more broadly. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to give short 5-minute openings, sort of this broader theme, or 6, 7. We don't know how long Dana's going to go. On media January 6th in American history, Dana's going to kick us off, and then Tressie, and then me. And then what we wanted to do is sort of have a conversational, lack of a fireside discussion that just reflects on a few broad themes, and then we'll have lots of time for sort of Q&A, given all the really amazing people who are. So with that.
And an awesome day. My head is exploding in fireworks just from all the new stuff I'm super excited about this because I work at really at the level of political psychology as it intersects with sort of media economics and media effects. And I'm just really excited for this project. So we sometimes talk about January 6th being about the big lie, right? That lie that Biden hadn't really won the election. But as we've discussed today, the beliefs and ideology and the worldview at the heart of January 6th were far larger than the big lie. Yet, belief in the big lie helped to serve the motivation to social identity, rooted in whiteness, Christianity, cultural conservatism, making perceived identity threat posed by the wrong kinds of Americans both salient and exploitable. My work examines misinformation not on the side of supply, right, that is misinformation that's out there, but on the side of demand. There is a market for wrong. Why is that? Because we're actually not driven to be accurate in our understanding of the world. We're actually driven by motivations that satisfy other fundamental needs. Social psychologists refer to these as epistemic needs, existential needs, and social needs. To sell books, I call these comprehension, control, and community. And also, people love it. Like when I get interviewed, people are like, "Oh, can you talk about the 3 C's?" I'm like, and that is why I didn't use those original words. Comprehension. That is, the big lie helped these folks understand how they could have lost. Easy, they didn't. Control. That is, the big lie helped them have power and agency. That is, they can take action to stop the certification of the electoral vote. Community. That is, the big lie helped them feel connected to their team. That is, a team of good, real Americans. January 6th offered all 3 of these, the people whose salient social identity had been chronically activated, reinforced, and distilled through a political and media apparatus that successfully leverages our social identity threat for power and for profit. But America's political history helps explain how and why this media apparatus operates so much faster and more furiously on America's right than on the left. So let's remind ourselves that over the last 40 years, different kinds of people have sorted themselves into our 2 major parties. There was the racial realignment of the parties in the 1960s and 70s, as the Democratic Party had finally stopped compromising on the issue of civil rights. And then the Republican Party responded by mobilizing white evangelicals through appeals to their whiteness, pushing back against efforts to end racial segregation of white Christian schools. The clustering of this white Christian moral majority on the right was accompanied by the geographic and cultural sorting of Americans into the 2 parties as well. But most interesting to me, perhaps, is the epistemic sorting. I am a political psychologist. The epistemic sorting of the parties as evangelical Christians and their epistemology, rooted in faith, emotion, and intuition, over evidence and data, increasingly clustered on the political right. And an entire way of knowing, that is, lay epistemology, gut-guided thinking, faith-guided thinking, and common sense, was coupled with this socio-demographic identity of sameness. Why this matters is that when we have good fit in a particular category, that is, when we look like our team, worship like our team, we live like our team, make sense of the world like our team does, then we will be more readily activated by out-group threat. We will respond more emotionally. We will participate more in response to threat activation. And so right now, the Republican Party is more efficiently activated, mobilized, which may also help account for the asymmetry that we currently find in the supply of misinformation in our information environment over the last decade, at least. Look no further than Fox News and what happened in the aftermath of the 2020 election to understand how these social identity-driven dynamics intersect with media economics, which is the other piece. It took 4 days for news organizations to declare Joe Biden the winner of 2020, and on November 3rd, Fox called Arizona for Joe Biden and was the first network to do so. 4 days later, Fox News' Brett Baer announced Biden as the 46th president. And for Fox viewers and Trump loyalists who had spent months hearing tales of likely voter fraud from Fox hosts, Fox's call on Arizona and the election constituted the ultimate identity threat. That violation was met with immediate pushback. Newsmax enjoyed a 500% increase in ratings. Trump told his supporters to stop watching Fox and start watching Newsmax. Former Fox viewers who had left the network for Newsmax after the election debacle reported feeling like moving on from Fox was like losing a friend or part of the family. Others felt satisfied by the appreciation they felt from Newsmax, as though Fox was taking them for granted. All this comes from reporting from Washington Post Jeremy Barr. So Fox opinion hosts increasingly crawled back to their viewers by doubling down on the big lie and the core identity threat underneath it. As the New York Times' Michael Grimbaum put it, Fox's content thus moved Trumpward. This Trumpward shift included a Trumpward shift in epistemology, guided by intuition and hunches rooted again in identity threat over evidence and truth. Tucker Carlson amplified a discredited conspiracy theory about the giant suitcases of fraudulent ballots, saying, "We're going to show you a video. You may have seen it. Seems real. Pretty unbelievable. We spent all day trying to find out exactly the context here. We know fraud took place." We know ballots just kind of showed up in various places. Note that Shane Moss and her mother, two Black female election workers in Atlanta, Georgia, not an accident, by the way, in the same way that Trump's, quote, bad things happen in Philadelphia was not an accident. Ms. Moss and her mother underwent months of harassment and death threats that destroyed their lives as a result of those false claims. It turns out when social identity needs shape our understanding of truth, facts no longer matter. And this is how the identity-driven wrongness is sustained and perpetuated on America's political right through the deliberate activation of identity threat by political elites and political media, capitalizing on a deep American history rooted in a palpable, motivating anger, not fear, but anger, aimed at a perceived demographic and status threat.
That's just delightful. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, though, seriously. Thank you for a truly engaging day. I've not only enjoyed hearing everyone, I've been trying to take notes for some of our public who's been following us on social media platforms, live stream, which dovetails with some the way that I work and some of the work that I've been doing actually more recently. So I've been writing and speaking quite a bit recently on how platforms are eating our publics. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think there's a sort of underlying assumption, someone mentioned earlier, that we've got these sort of like underlying assumptions or a sort of a bias that elections work. That might have been you, Dave, that elections work the way that they work, right? I think we have the same sort of bias about publics working the way that they've always worked, and that publics have the same affordance and access they've always had. I actually think that that's not necessarily true, and that it presents us with some challenges for the way that we think about everything. Collectivism, social action, electoral politics, media, both traditional media, citizen journalism, from the top down to bottom up. And so that's why I've been thinking about it. I think it happens at the micro level, institutional level, at the macro level. And I think about platforms because I think about the political economy. I'm a Black feminist who thinks about political economy through a Black feminist lens. And I think that platforms and publics is foundational to us understanding January 6th, because one of the things that all of the powerful actors involved in January 6th were able to do was to correctly identify the mechanism of power, attention, and affect necessary to further a cause. The fact that they were not successful in the way that we think they needed to be successful doesn't mean that they did not meet some of their goals and their aims, right? A spectrum, not a binary. I actually think January 6th was quite successful in many ways, right? So in my writing and thinking about platforms and publics, and what I mean when I say that platforms are eating our publics, I mean that it is foreclosing on our ability to collectively face, the John Dewey sense, self-organize in the Ida B. Wells sense, to define and challenge a problem in the Du Bois sense. Platforms are not just a technical solution. Platforms operate as capital, as container for imaginary ideas. They operate as media, as mediatization. And I think important for our conversation today, they operate as a set of politics. And when they do that, they really do change, and I would argue delimit the extent to which a public exists and can operate. And it does so unevenly, right? So there's less public for everyone. I want to be clear. There's less public for everyone presently than there was at any recent time in the past, pick a time, any time. There's less public for everyone. And this is why it's kind of tricky, I think, to name, because it is true, there's less public for everyone, but even less for some, for the marginal less public than there is for others. And that comes at the expense, some people to the benefit of others, right? So it makes it really hard for us to say, well, no, everybody is suffering, but not equally, or everybody has less access to a public. but not to the same degree and not to the same type. And so one way to imagine this is that when participants in January 6th can create a public, can call into a public the way they did at the Capitol, there is less public for other people that comes at somebody else. Right? Even if their ability to call into a successful public is eventually shut down, right? They are still able to call into state violence and foreclose on publicness for other groups of people. All right, so that is my bit of fun. All right, so I want to talk about this link between, more specifically here today, the way that a sort of historical continuity can happen at the same time as a contemporary rupture can happen, because it's been one of the things that has kind of jumped out at me in today's conversation. And I think it's important for us to hold how both of those things can be happening at the same time. So we've had this sort of slow moving de-evolution of publicness that I think is just a consequence of how capitalism does not like the risk and the variability of people being able to call into something outside of the market. And then there does seem to be something distinct about how this iteration of whatever you want to call it, platform capitalism, neoliberalism, digital capitalism, whatever it is, seems to be doing something really specific. It's changing how media works, it's changing how institutions can respond, it's changing how we can work, how we can live, how we can art, how we can imagine. It's changing fundamental assumptions. I don't think it's saying too much. So then we should think about then what is continued, what's the historical continuity? Well, there's one historical continuity that is specific to the January 6th case. And I want to speak about this study by Rebecca Bucci, David Kirk, and Robert Sampson. Robert Sampson's a well-known sociologist, and he and his students have managed this study for a very long time. But in managing that study, they had this moment after January 6th to observe how people in the study perceive the participants in January 6th, whatever you wanted to call it, as we talked today about how important it is to name things, right? And so since they managed the study, they had this moment when they were doing data collection for their annual data collection for it, to say, you know, how did they perceive the people in January 6th? They gave them three categories. Were they extremists? Were they protesters? Or were they patriots? Right, and we can think about all of the stuff that would go into all the political ideology, all your understanding of citizenship and the nation state that would go into what you would think of those three categories, right? And I think there are a couple of interesting things there for our conversation. One of them, someone mentioned, I think it was both Paul and Meredith earlier today made wonderful points about January 6th being thought of being made falsely equivalent to Black Lives Matter. So one of the things they tested was if you supported Black Lives Matter, no matter what your race, you were overwhelmingly likely to think that January 6th participants were extremists, which I actually think is potentially interesting news. All right. Right? You can think about how this then would put you at odds with top line media accounts of what we decided to call January 6th participants, right? How it can make you antagonistic to news accounts. You can think about how this would make you antagonistic to mainstream electoral strategy that has been absolutely resistant to labeling January 6th participants as dissidents or un-American, right? You can kind of see maybe why you would then have this uphill battle with people who feel strongly that these people should be cast out of the political imaginary, right? Across race. But here's what I find a little bit more interesting. But you gotta know, if you know anything about the history of this country, that race shows up somewhere. It doesn't show up here, but you gotta know it shows up somewhere. So where does it show up? Someone mentioned earlier that this slow moving intersection of patriarchy, misogyny, and racism showing up around January 6th. And that's where it shows up in the image of the image of the, because if you were a gun owner, I know. Oh, that's good. Yeah. So if you are a gun owner alone, right, It looked at gun ownership alone. The researchers found no relationship between gun ownership and a statistically significant pattern in perception of January 6th participants. But when they looked at gun ownership by race, they did find a connection. White gun owners were an outlier in viewing political uprisers most favorably. They thought of January 6th participants as patriots, right? The only outlier actually in the data, more than 70% of Hispanic gun owners and non-gun owners labeled participants as extremists, but white gun owners were significantly more likely to label January 6th participants as patriots. Why do I want to think about that? I want to think about it because I want to think about the link between race and all of these other intersecting identities that I think surface what actually Jardina would call white racial identitarian politics as these places of rupture around race and identity and how they express themselves in our current moment. And how I think the way that we think about race and history needs to consider both the historical continuities and these moments moments of rupture. That yes, we know that something like gun ownership matters, but again, gun ownership alone did not reveal this relationship. It was the intersection of gun ownership and race. So I think there's something that's happening here around the white racial imaginary that is both broadening and fracturing. And that we need a theoretical, empirical, and narrative work that captures that, because as we keep talking about today, the deep stories that are being tapped by the right is doing that very brutally. And platforms are being ruthless about their ability to commodify those deep stories. And the attention regimes that platforms only know how to do one thing, and that is amplify those deep stories. They know how to take powerful assets and amplify them at scale. And there's almost nothing more effectively powerful than the deep stories that are tapped into a vein of historical continuity that best explains contemporary rupture for which we do not have an empirically true story, but that needs to be explained, right? Where we don't yet have a folk theory to explain, people will create one. And what I'm arguing is that in a platform economy, it is uniquely skilled in a way of tapping into that deep vein and doing work that used to be manual, right? That you used to have to kind of go community by community and do. We've got now a socio-technical capitalist regime that can automate that, right? And figure out how to mobilize. It doesn't need our help in mobilizing that asset. And I actually do think that is distinct and something that we need to reckon with. Science, culture are not quite.
Knew I should have been the last speaker. Not only on the last panel, but after the day. Oh, wait, is that the screen?
Screen.
It is 6. It's on the screen.
Oh, that's too perfect.
That's all right, so what I wanted to do is just pull a few threads together. Some amplifying what folks have said today, earlier, as well as on this panel, and then maybe sort of push things in a few other different directions, and then we can sort of jump. Given the title, Media Generates in American History, it is worth remembering where I think Scott Alpus started us today in his presentation. America has a long history of political violence. Right, and it's just really worth realizing that that's the way we see continuities in political systems, not ruptures or one-offs. This was mentioned earlier, but it's worth saying in Wilmington, the 1898 election, there was a coup that overthrew the Republican-led Fusionist government. White Democrats killed over 200 people, dozens of others flee. What's worth noting is media is central to that story. The Raleigh News and Observer played a very key role. They published fake accounts of white women's rapes by Black men, made false allegations that Wilmington's Black population were preparing to take over. It played a key role in the devastation of violence in much the same way that I think Khadijah's work shows us the role that an earlier Tea Party movement normalized violence and normalized anti-democratic action. It also is worth remembering this other history of local news, because we tend to valorize local news as being bastions of democracy. Reality is, as Kathy Ward and Sid Benningfield show in their brilliant book, Journalism in Jim Crow, most local news in the South for much of the 20th century was horribly racist and in the service of white, one-party ethno-states, authoritarian states. Indeed, Robert Mickey's work, and I think this is the other theme that emerged a lot today, but it's worth putting a point on it. We're a young democracy. We are a very young multiracial democracy. Really, up until the 1970s, you had vast one-party states built around the white Democratic Party that existed through much of the South. Wasn't through the passage of rights amendments in the 1960s that you gradually see expansion of suffrage, as well as the ability to vote for non-whites in the US. When you think about the US comparatively as a democracy with that history in mind, it actually provides us with a much better sense of just how fragile we are as a nation when it comes to being truly multi-ethnic and multiracial. And again, it helps us also contextualize the US as a case among many other cases of countries that have also suffered democratic strain. That's where I'm going to end in a few minutes, in a minute. Dana talked about this, other people talked about this throughout the day today, but it's worth emphasizing this as well. Partisan sorting that happens in the post-civil rights, right? So this is the work of Liliana Mason and others who basically show that starting in the 1960s and afterwards, see the sorting of various identities within the two parties. So white evangelicals, white rural, white wealthy, white middle class folks becoming part of the Republican Party's coalition. And the Democrats become a multiracial, multi-ethnic, more secular, urban, and poor and lower class party. And this coincides with other shifts as these coalitions move in two different directions. So the Democratic Party, as Doug McAdam has argued, becomes the party that institutionalizes the agenda of the civil rights movement. And with that, expanding the civil rights movement, not just in terms of race, but also in terms of LGBTQ equality and other struggles for equality. The Republican Party, meanwhile, and this is Anthea Butler's work, becomes sort of an institutional home for white evangelical projects, which includes the anti-abortion movement, anti-LGBTQ rights movement, etc. What's key is that prior to this moment, the parties were not well sorted, right? And Dana mentioned this before. So there were not clear political issues that voters could weigh in on. If you wanted to vote for civil rights before the 1960s, you couldn't. It didn't map onto partisanship in a clear way. You had Democrats who were pro-civil rights and Republicans who were pro-civil rights. So when you hear people wanting to go back to the good old days before things were so polarized, for instance, and so much partisanship, it's that the parties were simply incoherent on the defining political issues of our time. And therefore, an apolitical, deeply unequal consensus ruled over the US and colored our politics in various ways. That's story one. Story two is just changes in media institutions we've heard so much about. Tressie got us to the moment of like platforms hollowing out public life in various ways. It is worth mentioning, I know a number of people talked about this, Paul, Silvio, is really that sort of the decline of the mass media era and mass media authority over much of the 20th century. Rise of the conservative media as an alternative in the World War II and post-World War II era, like Nicole Hemmer's work, et cetera, but sort of that broad epistemological, moral, and political fragmentation, as well as the key role, as Scott reminded us before, of like changes in regulation and things like broadcast, like getting rid of the fairness doctrine, which led to shifts in media economics, the rise of talk radio, Fox News to be able to figure out how to make money in partisan broadcasting, all of which from the early 2000s sort of give us sort of a much more partisan media sphere, and especially a developed conservative media sphere. And then the internet being used in certain ways, particularly as we've seen lots of research around like white supremacist violence, stop and steal, et cetera. But also, good old days, fueling movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, right? And all of which sort of leads us at our moment is that what we see, our politics is so divisive now because struggles for equality and against unequal social power is being fueled by these same platforms that are targeting unequal racial and social order. So media, as well as platforms, are enrolled both in projects of social justice and social defense of particular order. Where I want to conclude before we sort of jump in is just to think about not just what came to a sort of head on January 6th, but also its aftermath. Most comparative political scientists agree that the country has been autocratizing since 2016. Francesca wrote about this beautifully in her chapter for the volume. The US has a long racialized history of efforts to restrict the vote, voter ID laws, questioning safety and security of elections that's institutionalized within the Republican Party. But also it's worth thinking about the aftermath of January 6th, right? Some work that I've done with Hisu Zhang, who's amazing, who's here, sort of puts a point on this. During the 2022 midterm elections, 291 Republicans ran for office at the state and federal level while denying, contesting, or otherwise questioning the results of the 2020 presidential election. 179 of those candidates won their races. If that's not a clear and present threat to democracy, I don't know what is. The Variety of Democracy Index, their 2023 report, lists the US as an autocratizer alongside Indonesia, Brazil, Ghana, Greece, and Poland, and moving on a path of electoral autocracies such as El Salvador, Hungary, and India. In electoral autocracies, there's a lack of a rule of law, lack of free and fair elections, lack of universal suffrage, and transfer of power, right? And where I want to end is just by saying it's only by acknowledging that January 6th was political violence with political objectives rooted in political history can we actually start the hard work of creating inclusive, equitable, multiracial democracy where difference is articulated in terms of adversaries and not enemies. With that, a little bit. I don't know where we're going to start, but one thing that came to mind while you guys were talking, are there counter deep stories? Are there counter deep stories that help us articulate forward thinking the world we want to
Can I take that in 1 second, but first say something
live?
else?
Yes.
Just like, what I think is kind of interesting is that, you know, we talk about the concept of intersectionality, and folks who are studying this space where people are abused online, you know, the idea that like if you occupy kind of like target of like people online. What I think is interesting is that what we're talking about, like when you were talking about the idea that these platforms amplify deep stories at scale, and that there are, we're talking too about how it's whiteness combined with these other categories, we don't have a term to describe intersectionality on the right. And it's the intersection of multiple identity categories that all align, that seems to literally empirically exacerbate some of these trends. Like there's work that shows that if you're looking at trust in media among conservative Republicans who live in rural spaces, they are the ones who exhibit the lowest levels of trust in media, right? So it is a different kind of intersectionality, but it's intersectionality of right-wing identities, right? It's
not a different kind of intersectionality. That's intersectionality. It's just that white people don't like to be thought of as white, and so they haven't done their intersectional white identity. But intersectional theory intersectional theory has always said that it would do more for white people than it would ever do for marginalized identity, for them to think of themselves as racialized. Oh, you.
I'm not.
I'm in favor, y'all get together.
Happy to be everybody's like digester, that's.
But no, I'm dead serious. I agree with you. No, really, I think that the work that has been most exciting, and that is work that absolutely, more critical whiteness scholars, and I want to be very specific in calling that out, more critical whiteness scholars have always said that there has not been more development in the, it's not a mistake. It is not an oversight. You try to get published the work that says that there are intersecting white identities.
Let's do it.
into journals in the center of your field, and I support it. But I'm telling you that's not an oversight. Yeah, yeah, but no, I agree, yeah.
Well, it's just interesting to me that the empirics from political scientists all point in the direction of that, like it's very, very clear. But that's not a term, that terminology is not, that's not the term we use.
In that space. Political right, to embrace the distinctions. Because it's part of it's the power in the movement, A, to not think about being white, and then B, not hyphenate white, because if you're gonna maintain a demographic majority,
That's right.
in some
It starts
way,
to fall
you need a
apart.
project of incorporation, not differentiation. So it had to come as a political project on the other side as a countervailing force.
Well, there we go. There's the countervailing deep stories. That was what you opened with. What are the other deep stories?
Oh, yeah, no, I think that there are tons that, now, are they, I don't like to think of them as counter, to be fair. I think that, as someone mentioned earlier, you then are accepting the dominant frame. To me, the story that whiteness is socially constructed, that, that, for example, that, the conversation that we just had about intersectionality, I think all of those deep stories exist, and that we have the literature for that, exists, but the work of making them, dominant deep stories is a different story, and whether or not we have every time we have the capacity to turn those deep stories into what we might call dominant or master narratives, what we have seen is the very quick co-option of them into commodified hashtags, commodified counter social movements, corporatized social movements, corporate co-option. So one of the things that I think I think about is how quickly something that is a sort of radical call for calling in or for collective action becomes a tagline for a Dove commercial, right? And so neutralizing its political possibility. And so there are many deep stories. It's just that they also, when they, in an attention economy, when they have the ability to call in political action, they also have the ability to make someone money. And then that depoliticizes them and neutralizes them. And so I think if anything, we've learned that queer communities and Black communities have a ton of deep stories, and they make a lot of white companies a lot of money, and then don't do a ton because of that to often make sustainable social movements.
Yeah, and that's the counterpoint where I wanted to go after that is it even possible to have those deep stories that are politically liberatory in the platform era?
Yeah.
So much of the monetization and commercialization of movements in public life, as well as, and I think Meredith made this Clark. Meredith made this Clark. Clark made also the means in which the weaponization and co-optation among rival political movements can happen in this space as well. So it's that double, both commercialization, monetization, and weaponization as a counter political project.
Meredith also made the Clark that point I would strongly agree with. Institutions gets a bad rap, but I think because we think of sometimes social institutions, and I want to maybe make the point of also thinking about organizations. which is just a collection of people working towards a goal. And I think that that is really important for radical imagination. And so, because at some point you got to move from the micro to the action part, and I just don't know of any other way. If somebody's got something else, please tell me. But we can sometimes narrow. I get one of my forces to ride into the dust is narrowing our imagination about politics to only electoral politics, right? And forgetting that most people. Someone said earlier, taking the question of like, how do we get people turning to vote? You were like, well, not today, because there's no election today. But even our imagination, do you see about all of our political activity gets narrowed to this one time every other year when really all of our political identity making happens through all of this other activity and interaction. And to my mind, that's where all of that work tends to happen. And for that, we need these other organizational spaces, some that can be mediated and many that I think need to not be mediated by platforms. And so is that, it may not be my thing, but it's religious institutions, is it community, is it not-for-profit, is it even types of, work and art spaces, educational spaces, et cetera. But I think thinking of the political possibility of all of those is the place where deep stories have to be fomented and collected.
And I was gonna, also to call out Jenny Stromer-Galley, I don't know where she's here somewhere. Yeah, so your great point earlier about pop culture and entertainment as being an important source of these stories and identities that matter for politics, but also like as a political communications scholar, almost entirely of our frame of reference, and only sort of happens in this other area of media and popular. Dan, I'm wondering if you can tell us like
Which part?
well, it's sort of like the sources of identity and stories from a political politics.
So what I was actually thinking about, the one place that brings me some, so let me just move away 1 second. One thing that causes me to, look, I am just notoriously idealistic. I know it's awful, but one place where I do get hope is when I'm in the data, like literally when I'm in a data set, I'm looking at folks, I'm looking at their, and truly when it comes to opinions on public policy, two parties are not mono. And that brings me, so I just working on a survey on knowledge and opinion on abortion, which if you tune into conversation at the national level, you feel like it's very simple. You feel like it's pro-life, choice, right? And when you actually look at the data and ask really detailed questions about how to perceive it, what does pro-life mean, what does choice mean, what does the 6 week mean, what do you think? It really is so much more complex, even among as conservative as Republican. So my question is there a way to capitalize on the fact that there is so much nuance in the policy of Americans? Identify not just as leaning Democrat or leaning Republican, but among those people who say, yeah, I'm a Democrat, I'm Republican, I'm strongly. Is there a way to work within that space to understand, to create those stories that allow them to see that we are working on this project? We are all working on this project. Many of us are not exactly sure where we stand on some of these issues. And is there a way to have a conversation that is not rooted in identity? And I do think there is some literature that suggests that there are ways to transcend those identity categories that we've talked about. The problem is that our current media environment, when you move up in these levels, it does not allow us to operate outside of those social identity categories because they're just activated all the time. But that's not, it can be otherwise. There can't, like we talk about otherwise, it can be otherwise.
So I think that the challenge that I have in thinking about this is that hardening, mobilizing of identity is exactly what movement is about, right? So we can talk about complexity and abortion rights views or pro-life views all we want, but if you're looking to institutionalize reproductive freedom in the United States, for that movement. And you need people to,
Producing people.
exactly. You need people to think about it in terms of the movement identity, right? If you're fighting for equality, right, you need people to think in terms of an identity that can be advanced as a set of political claims and contest power. So like, I think what you're talking about runs against, like, that would be great if we were all equal, but we're not.
I get what you're saying, but at some level, is it possible then, is it the case that these social movements that you're talking about then can operate hand in hand with democratic system when people are not all?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is like, that's exactly what, so at its best, right? Democracies should be about, you know, Mahmoud Mamdani's phrase of like adversaries, not enemies, right? Like,
Right.
you
Yeah.
contest power
Yep.
at the ballot box, you build power however you can,
Yes.
including by strengthening and hardening identities, as well as the identities.
But that's not how psychology works. Social identities, the way that we operate as social animals is that if you get me to think enough in terms of my social identity, that I feel like your work poses an existential threat to my ability to live, that I'm going to see you as an enemy, not an adversary.
But clearly there must be like gradations of this, because we've had many successful elections, right, that haven't gotten any existential threat to that state. And I don't know of anyone, like, for instance, here's an example, right? So like, I would say for a lot of groups represented by the Democratic Party coalition, the right is an threat, right? And yet they're not storming the Capitol when Donald Trump got elected president. So why do we see that disparity? Other than, of course, like one side is forced.
Well, I think there's also an asymmetry there, but when you
Yeah.
look at the data on how people perceive the Republican Party when they have high identity salience within the Democratic Party, there is a perception that members of the other party are less than human, that they are morally more distant from me, that I do hate them, that they are a threat. So those things are real, those things happen. So I appreciate what you're saying about the idea of enemy versus adversary, but if you're talking about how these social movements need people to embody these identities in order to fight for justice, I don't know how that works in an environment where you also see the other side as merely an adversary in this sort of like debate. Just based on human psychology, I don't know how that works.
But I'd like to introduce two concepts for social psychology, which is this idea that we like linked fate, right? Which is that you can consider, and I hear you on activating sort of like a master identity, but there is this mediating effect of thinking that my behavior, which I think might be low in some groups versus others, which is that my behavior impacts others, right? And so I may think that, which is I think might help explain why some people can absolutely see someone as an enemy and not, however, think that I enact violence to meet ends. You see, because my behavior is linked to the well-being of other people that I care about, or care about. It's saying a bit too much because it's
So linked fates with
individual
them?
self-interest. No, linked fates with people like me who I share. Our fates are linked. So this is a shared group identity, right? So there are certain things that I think I can maximize my individual interests by doing, but I think would diminish the interest of people's whose faith mine are linked to in a group, right? So I can think that voting, to smite my enemy, right? Because it will improve my individual well-being, and also harm somebody. But I think, yeah, but I also like other people like that need us to be okay, right? And so you can see strong group identity among people whose activated identity might be that they are Black, that they are women, that they other strong identities such as that mediates this ability to act from maximizing their individual interests through violence. So even if you, so I'm not quite buying that what you have at the group level is just an aggregate of individual grievance. There is a mediating effect of group behavior, right, at the group level, and I think some of that would be linked fates. And knowing that, one, that at the linked fate level, that any act of violence or acting out in that way will be visited upon a group of people. But also that maximizing interest for the group, that you are acting in the best interest of the group. And I think that that might not be there for the type of interest that you're talking about.
That's it's so funny, because I'm thinking like, then how is it possible that that concept is moderated by some other elements related to power? Because I would imagine that the folks who were at the Capitol on January 6th, even if they had a sense that like my fates are linked, like all of our fates are linked, they could also feel like, yeah, and we are going to act out violently, and it's okay because this is just, and there's not going to be real punishment for us because we are in a position of power and we have the right to act out violently.
Yes, and that's what we're saying, other groups don't.
Yeah.
Right. So it's
Listen, I mean,
Yeah,
right?
and that is not actually, that there is a very serious asymmetry there
Yeah.
that would make them not the same thing. So while they may be activating the same psychological frame, they are not activating the same. Yes, because at the social psychological level, power is involved.
Yeah. I would also just one piece to add to is that I think when we think about the calls to action on January 6th that we've heard from a number of folks today, and it's very well documented, it's about not only sort of historical disenfranchisement of white people and white Christians, it's also about a threat to bodily security, a threat of violence, of rape of white women. It's very graphic images that relate back to immediate security, right? I think when you think about other stories of existential threat, tend to, I think, in more liberatory movements, think in terms of structural power as it gets worked out. Now, there's a very real political violence component for us in debate too, but also sort of thinking about existential threat in terms of working on groups in various ways that power exercises itself through systems and institutions that legalize and legitimize violence in ways that become routinized patterns that you don't necessarily see the same response or same calls to action in that way.
So when I have written about the sort of threat salience on the right, and I always get pushed back, folks are like, no, I don't think that conservatives have high threat salience. And it's like, well, no, it's not existential threat salience, it's interpersonal threat salience. It's literally like physical body threat salience. It's not, people are like, if Republicans had high threat salience, they would act on climate change. I was like, yeah, but that's not what we're talking about. We are talking exactly about that. It's a threat of interpersonal violence. And I also think that, you know, I did some work on looking at support for vigilantism. And it's very much about wanting to have physical autonomy to be able to carry out justice on one's own so that one can get back at individuals who do you wrong. And it's about having not just bodily autonomy, but like, I want to be able to be a lone ranger who acts on my own to carry out whatever justice needs to be carried out against whatever things I had perceived that have been wrongdoing. And that too is something that we see a very asymmetric support for that kind of vigilantism.
And then also like that bodily vigilantism was also the cornerstone of fascism as a political movement. It is 6:30. Why don't we open up to some questions as well? I know we're 10 minutes past that, but we have great people in the room.
Yeah, so this is actually, I want to shift it a little bit. I'm glad you ended on the fascism question. This is kind of center left and left wing identity making. Recently, there's been a lot of online furor over whether or not Trump qualifies as a fascist. I'm thinking about the recent book, Did It Happen Here? The tete-a-tetes between Corey Robin and John Gans online, which have become very heated. I don't want you to weigh in on whether or not Trump is a fascist. Rather, what I want to try to figure out is you have these ostensible allies who are really going into a blood feud with one another across these two sides about this question. What accounts for like the salience of this question? Like, does it matter? Right?
Oh, gosh. Thank you.
Everybody agrees that like
Thank
something
you for
is
asking.
wrong. So
I have so many thoughts that I should not say. So, I'm going to know them both, think they're great thinkers that have obviously contributed a lot. I just want to let's get that out of the way. So I think there are a couple of things. If I wanted to be very high-minded and theoretical, I think that there is as we've been having this conversation about the slipperiness of moments of rupture, of wanting to, use the tools we have to capture these moments and fix them in time, right? So that we can, I think, account for, chaos may not be the right word, but we are trying to fix in moment in time things that are in flux, right? So I think there's some of it. I think there is also, if I wanted to be a little less high-minded, but I think still in the space of being, I hope, intellectually generous, I think there is a methodological imperative here to want to draw really theoretically clear lines around so that we can do the work that we know how to do, that we're trained to. And then I also think that there is a lot of intellectual thank you. Involved in, you have developed a track record, an archive of how to understand the world, a form of intellectual production, of knowledge production that is frankly threatened by a model that might be hybridized, that might be hard to classify, right? And getting there first or getting there, right, there's a lot of consequences to doing that. And the consequences are highest where the stakes are lowest. That's why you see it among people who agree with each other the most, and not with people far apart with each other. Right. And so I think that's why you see it amongst like colleagues and friends and on the left, where really we agree where the stakes are high. We know it's a threat, right? What you're really fighting about, you're at the edges of the threat because there are really no stakes there. And having said all of that, yeah, that's just. Yeah, like what I really appreciate Corey very much, but what a
Khadijah, sorry.
Yeah, now I'm like, what was I gonna say? I mean, the one thing I had wanted to just raise was that I really enjoy Nicholas Winter's work. I don't know if you've read Dangerous Frames, but he draws on social psychology to talk both about like intersectionality and about like group threat and social threat and the way that the media frames certain issues can activate race and gender, even if it's not explicit, right? And how there's certain things we grow up with understanding only in terms of race and gender that we don't realize. And it's not like the school busing thing, it's like other things, other issues that we actually hear. And I'm trying to think of an example, but he basically plays with language so that it activates. And he starts off with the metaphor of the alphabet. For those of us who are probably a lot of us learn the alphabet through gender. And so the vowels are A's, the soft sounds, A-E-I-O-U. Did you guys learn that way?
Yeah.
Maybe it was just me in Christian school, okay. Right, Miss A, Miss E, so they're all women, right? And then all of the consonants are hard and strong, and so they're all masculine. And so we grow up understanding the alphabet through the lens of gender. And so he kind of builds upon that through political psychology and schema to talk about how we understand political issues through that lens. And I actually think it's really useful when we talk about like the empirical work that people are asking through political science and saying, well, I'm asking something that has nothing to do with race and gender. And he's saying, no, actually, your question is both race and it's gendered. I mean, a lot of political scientists do that, but he does it in really interesting ways to talk about schema. So I just, more of a comment than a question.
I love it. Right, the scales of time.
Oh, right, I'm gonna add and do another comment, so add to this, because I think, I wanna push a little back. On like the concept of threat and the idea that this threat has been deeply manufactured via media and so like, I agree in the sense that I've heard from my respondents, this idea of threat, this like, I can't put a Trump poster in my yard. I'm scared to like profess my support for Trump. You hear it in the culture war dynamic of like, students are scared of us because we can't be conservative.
Self-censorship.
Self-censorship and freedom of ideas as being part of the protected need. And so I don't, and I think what's interesting or what gets lost in not considering whiteness as intersectionality is like, I am the biggest threat in a society, right? As a white woman, I pose the largest risk. And when it comes to public safety, for the largest amount of people around me. And yet I've been raised my whole life in the world of where I grew up as like, I am, my safety is constantly positioned as the concern for many when I am very much so. And so I think.
Wait, so what's the pushback?
So no, the pushback is like, how, and I don't know how you're seeing this in the data, but like when you were saying the salience, the physical threat being the most salient, like, what is that?
Meaning that for conservatives, for people who identify as like strong conservatives.
Yes.
And who say being a Republican is an important part of who I am. When I talk about being conservative, I use we and not us, etc. That it is a sense of their like physical safety that is very much what's correlated with all of the things that we're looking at in political psych. So like the fact that they're lower in tolerance for ambiguity, lower in need for punishment, very much driven by this sort of physiological threat monitoring system. That's like, I'm keenly aware of threats in my environment. I double check to make sure that my door is locked, et cetera, et cetera. Like this constant sense that like, I might be the victim.
But they're not.
Yeah.
But so what I wonder is like, is there then a question in this where it's asked, are the threat? Like that's what I'm wondering, like, because this is where I think there is this disjuncture, right? Where
But
but in terms of the
I hear what you're
story,
saying, but I'm just studying
like
perception.
understanding it.
Right.
I think if we're
So
trying
can
to,
I say, so I've worked on this project, and we've got a couple of papers with some public health researchers about deaths of despair. Anybody familiar with this research? The perception of status loss is so great among some white Americans that it is having at a population level an effect on their life expectancy.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, I think, at the psychological cognitive level is what Dana Gall is saying. It doesn't matter whether it's real.
It doesn't matter if it's
They
real.
think they're under, no, but what you're saying, which is also true, is that, so what?
right.
Like, which to your point is our paper. Our paper in response to the death of this mayor was, it's not real.
Right.
And so it's not a public health crisis, like there's nothing to fix here.
Right, there's
It
nothing-
is
yeah. How could you be
a
more?
almost imperceptible narrowing
Yeah.
of, an unfair accumulation of status advantage, and
Yeah.
that's not a problem to solve.
Yeah.
We're not actually supposed to intervene there at the population level. If you cannot acculturate to this negligible loss of status, advantage, I don't know what to tell you. What we're talking about is sort of perceived risk and lack of resilience, right? What I think might help us bridge this, I just want to introduce this concept of like racialized emotions by Eduardo Bonilla Silva and others, but this idea, because emotions are not rational. And some of what I think we might be talking about is to what extent are we supposed to intervene in a process that just happens and that occurs? Well, it happens and it matters to the extent that people act on it in the realm of social action. But I think I might go so far as what I might argue is that not every group level perception is a social problem until it is acted on at a group level and impacts another group level's ability to act.
Right.
So it's not a problem actually that white people feel lost or sad or threatened. It is a problem when they show up on the Capitol with guns and whatever, right? And so for us to find the right level of analysis there. And so I think what we might be losing here, which I'm obviously losing, I'm a sociologist, of course I come back to this, is that the aggregation of individuals is not necessarily the same thing as group behavior. That something else is happening there and that we gotta get the right level of diagnosis for it.
And I think what's key about this, is that January 6th is emblematic of defense. It's defense of unequal set of status and group interests for white and white Christians in this.
Yeah.
That threat is real, and then the defense gets mobilized. The defense gets mobilized to protect that.
And can I also say they're not all, and I want to go a step further when I brought up the racial economy of emotions, that as much as, yes, they were defending and yes, they feel threatened. No, what caught people there once we go back and we actually look to Francesca's research and reporting and to our own eyes, they were having a good time.
Yeah.
They're having parties. People were feeling threatened in the
Yeah.
moment. These are people who were like, just like people who showed up at lynching parties, just like cookout.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I just wanted to, it was like the hierarchy here of racialized emotions to be able to retroactively apply status threat. Says whose emotions we value structurally and hierarchically is also an imbalance here of structural power. To be able to retroactively say that you were feeling threatened and that what was activated in you is status, but we saw with our own eyes that no, you were actually having a great time.
Yeah, I mean,
Anything that happened.
Yeah.
That was their defense.
Yeah.
It was self-defense, and I think that's where.
and that was part of the,
We're illuminating then to know that these kinds of perceptions of interpersonal threat and monitoring for interpersonal, well, most socially, culturally conservative.
Well,
I think
we're just in the history of those groups, right? Like those perceptions get organized in certain ways that aren't political, right? And so it's like the plantation owner being like, I'm constantly feeling threatened by that, the stakes might be uprising.
right.
Okay. I mean, 2024, like that legacy is still there, right? Like that is deep pattern cultural, rooted
Yes,
in
it's
power.
rooted in power and
That's
culture and
why
all
we
of
have
that.
policing.
Yes,
right? Like-
and some of these correlations hold, like, I get that I'm the lone psychologist in the panel. But some of these traits and these correlations hold when we look, internationally, if you look comparatively, and there is this clustering, and it's like, well, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know, but it is the case that people who are monitoring for interpersonal threat tend to cluster over here. And they tend to be like more conservative on issues related to sex, race, immigration, crime, blah, blah, blah. It just is.
Well, we did have colonialism back then. So racial capitalism, plantations. That's how I might explain it. Khadijah, I know I saw you.
Okay, I actually remember, I'm sorry, I remember, part of the reason I brought up Nicholas Winters is because he talks about soccer mom, for example, as a white intersectional identity that gets activated really easily through political science and political discourse and media framing. And so he talks about, like, he was the first kind of political psychologist that I saw who did this kind of work that talks very explicitly about how intersectionality applies to his work. And then the other thing is that to the question, I guess this is a question and less of a comment, which is like the question of like, well, why does it matter if it's fascism or not, right? It's the same question of like, and I know most people, I mean, talk about things that people avoid talking about or stay clear Israel and Gaza, but the question of genocide is also really important, right? And all of this is about the narratives that we tell, the way that we try to understand history and who we should be with and who we should not. So when we're talking about morality, I mean, these are melodramas that we have kind of played out and we have helped us understand our own history. And so fascism being linked to white supremacy is really key to people having to kind of try to undermine that being part of what Trump's appeal is, because they're also trying to rebrand white supremacy, not just as like white pride used to be like a way that people were trying to rebrand it, but now for all sorts of other ways. I mean, some of you probably can think of them faster than me. I was trying to think of all the ways that white supremacists talk about identitarians or like white, oh Lord, it's
Race
white civil rights, white,
Race realism.
Yeah, like there's just all these kinds of reframing, and that is because it is important whether or not it's fascism. It is important whether or not it's white supremacy, and I think that's part of the question. And I guess my last question is like, when we talk about violence and we're talking about January 6th, I'm trying to also be like, but the Supreme Court is fucking violence. My language, but it's violence, right? Like women being forced to carry like pregnancies that will kill them. Is actually violence. And so there's also, I mean, I know we talk about structural violence, but I think we also have to pair like the Jan 6 folks being like, no, we're working in concert with the structural violence that is already made manifest and empowered. And so I guess the question part is like, you guys see, like, you know, do you see those things as, you know, like the question of violence and like where, like how you're framing and understanding violence? And also, I feel like I just had another question every now. The question of like language, like is it like where are we falling?
I love that question because I mean I think I feel in discourse, and I think that the metaphors that we use are so important because, as you say, they are all about us trying to understand a world that we can't see and touch all of the elements. So we use language, the metaphors to help us understand. It sometimes is literally as simple as who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, and more importantly, which one's not. Right? So what we are asking is, when we are fighting over whether or not this is fascism, I think one of the reasons why we are having this fight right now is yes, it's about Donald Trump, but it was also because we started having a conversation Jim Crow was a fascist. It was about the story we started telling ourselves about this like shifting of an American narrative in a moment, this pushback against the 1619 narrative, pushback against a reorientation about an American narrative that even people that agree couldn't quite get over a hump of an internalized narrative about who they thought the good and the bad guys were, which means which one have I been all of this time? And I say this to even people again that I respect and like. It is hard. Want to talk about threat salience to an identity? It is hard for people to accept that even I, a person who has gotten it right, and I've been on the right side of this thing, but if you shift this a little, you're saying that I haven't always been on the exact right side of that story this entire time. I think that is part of why you would see somebody see people in this moment push back in that way against some of the language, right? So yes, it matters what we call things, and it matters that the violence that we would, that why we struggle with calling this violent. Well, what, It wasn't like they, they didn't go and they didn't shoot a bunch of people, right? And it's because there was so much violence happening inside. The structural violence mirrored the violence that was happening outside, to your point, right? Someone has kind of made the point that the very fact that at the same time you have these laws that are gutting, right, democratic participation, it could be happening, those happening at the same time is exactly why you would have people arguing over whether or not we should call this a coup or not, right? It is because it shifts just ever so slightly whether or not we can hold ourselves accountable for the fact that we have voted for someone who has allowed this Supreme Court to exist in this iteration, right? It shifts our in a way. So that's why the language, I think, always matters. The metaphors always.
You know who's been super helpful? I don't know if he's written formally on this, but Stuart Coles, you may be familiar with. He's an Iraq war vet, and he writes very passionately about how we think about violence and how when people say, well, it's fine as long as you're not being violent, and he really pushes back against that and talks about how there is so much institutionally supported violence. And he will remind people all of the time, here we say this is okay, and this is okay, and this is okay. So how are you going to then try to say that violence is not okay? There's so many instances of it that we think not only are they okay, but they're necessary and they're good. One thing that we haven't talked about that maybe I'm gonna get run over by a bus if I talk about, but I will anyway. Something that, actually, Tressie, when you were talking about, so about how if I change the metaphor or the lens through which I see this, all of a sudden then I have to face the fact that maybe I have behaved in ways that are conflicted, or maybe I have supported things that I shouldn't have supported. We haven't talked about the concept of intellectual humility, and I know that I know Shannon, we can fight later. But the way that I think about intellectual humility in a very helpful iteration is the idea of what Penny Cook describes as actively open-minded thinking, which is always being open to the possibility that, not just that you might be wrong, but actively looking for opportunities to seek out counter-exemplars that maybe could update your view and update your view about yourself. Right? Like, I don't know how many times today I have been reminded of things that I am maybe not thinking about holistically, or maybe being myopic about, but like, I freaking love that. Like the idea of like being open to the possibility that your own impression, your beliefs, your knowledge is itself either incomplete or founded on, shaky footing.
Or that it's evolving all the time.
Right? I mean, but truly, I will just say, I don't think that I see enough of that in the discipline among, and I think that would be wonderful. We're not fully cooked. We're not done.
Are there some things we should not be open to, though?
Of course. But
So, okay, so all I want to say is, this is the question I was gonna ask
She
on.
said,
I was gonna ask this question in the earlier panel about like, what should research look like, But like, I think that we really have to be attuned to the role that we play as researchers in what we call things, in the kind of research that we do, and the types of things that we normalize, and the unintended consequences that those things might have. And intellectual humility, and this idea of it, is one of those things that, this is like to Tressie's point, like we fundamentally agree, we're arguing on the margins here, but like it is one of the things that there are so many premises to which I agree with, but I worry about the way that could be taken and weaponized by people who are not arguing here in the margin.
that's why I have leaned towards actively open-minded thinking, because I think that really suggests an active seeking of truth, that I am open to reconsidering all of the time because I'm truth seeking. Not because I always think that I'm wrong, but because I'm actively truth seeking all the time.
I agree with the spirit of this, but considering my work, I would be remiss if I didn't point out a couple of little things. And I'm just gonna do it. I'm sorry, I'm gonna do it. I'm just gonna do it. It's Friday, and I didn't get to fry my cream. But I didn't get to do it. So, thank you. As of like yesterday at 3 p.m., there have been 82 bills across this country introduced to ban DEI legislation across this country. 13 have been approved. 12 have become law. As of yesterday, 82. 13 approved, 12 have become law, so one pending. Others working their way through various state legislatures. University of Michigan has instituted this disruptive activity crackdown to keep students from protesting. You've got artificial intelligence. Universities start to use AI to surveil students who may be thinking about protesting. Campus cuts coming mostly to humanities programs, and summarily dismissed 20 workers at the University of Arizona this past week because they did work that could be interpreted as doing diversity work. And a scholarship was just canceled at Duke because not because it does not comply with the Supreme Court decision, but that it could be interpreted as not complying. So again, anticipatory compliance, because it is a scholarship that was earmarked for African students. In this environment, I suspect that something like intellectual humility would be applied in a way that would not, that would reinforce a march towards the accrual of power that is trending in one direction, right? I just think there are a lot of forces out there right now that are instilling a lot of humility for some people and not nearly enough humility for others. That there's a lot of discipline of some.
Saw your hand a while ago. Sorry, I want to loop back around.
I wanted to ask you something for, how could I, if I'm thinking space. But what about the commission afterwards, to have the public on now? Is there binary if I believe all this, by there's power, that thought, there's this change, Adam, yeah. They got their case, and it was, so, talking about that. Just that, but what I was really thinking, we're talking about, has there been thought of how Ferguson and how groups of power or structural nation, it does, those people in the capital, color or margin, it would be a whole nother bloodbath. How come we're not, as a lay person who do the last study, not addressed at all? What are we talking about?
The first question was like, you have to buy it wholesale for politics thing, I guess.
Yeah, so what we do know is that there's data that suggests that even after the commission, I believe numbers were something like 75% of Republicans reported that continued belief in big lie was a very important part of looking at in belief that January 6th was just political expression, and exercising was also a really important part of it. So I will say it does seem to nothing in terms of this.
And I think from our discussion earlier, we all concur with the fact that the race of the January 6th really mattered for the response. And I think somebody said it where never would have gotten to that moment
Yeah.
had the race.
Yeah, I think somebody even called this the post-Ferguson moment, that we needed to think of this as like, yeah, we got here because of Ferguson, that you know, needed this idea to think of it as a counterweight to Ferguson.
It's 7, so I'm going to give you the last question. Yeah.
This has been really great discussion on, I think, language. But going back to Dr. Cottom's earlier point about how I guess like a lot of times our discussions about politics are so limited to, oh, the election, how are we going to get people to vote? I'm wondering if this framing and this focusing on multiracial democracy sort of does that same thing. If it's so, I guess like that idea of democracy, I think in common parlance is just so rooted in the idea of elections. And then also I think simultaneously in the American context, thinking about, oh, American democracy as this great ideal that we've constantly been striving towards. And I guess just like what sort of possibilities it enables or forecloses.
I love this as a concluding question. Let's maybe go right down the line.
I'm gonna actually draw a line back to Meredith's point earlier, that it presumes that you had a strong foundation built on it, that you're just refining around the edges, right? So I do think that there's, and I think part of the reason why every attempt to sort of like write the cricket room of the discourse, and the public discourse about is this fascism, is this democracy, or whatever it is. One of the reasons it's so contentious is that it is a threat to the idea, one of the ruling deep stories of American democracy, which is that it is fundamentally linear, right, and self-perfecting, right? Somewhat like a market, that if we would just sort of leave it alone to do its thing, and that's why social movements are fundamentally a threat, right? Because if you just let it do its thing, look what it's got, look how far it's gotten, right? And that we've got the fundamentals down, and that the fundamentals were written into its structure, when in fact, the only thing that is actually ever approximating democracy has been challenges to it, right? But that again is like this, that is a threat to, I think, I would argue, one of the sort of like foundational American deep stories. Not to mention that you think it's racialized, because who of course is always challenging and trying to get the American deep story to kind of live up to its ideals, right? And racialized and gendered and all these politics respected in their own ways. So yeah, that's what I would say. So yeah, I do think it forecloses on some possibilities, because we could never get to the Angela Davis quote, we never really grasp at the root of the thing, right? We can never actually get to the really important issues and questions, because you're arguing about, things at the edges, right? Expanding the Supreme Court, as important as that may be, to like the election year, but not really to like the fundamental question of like democracy, right? At the same time, it is the way that we have made inroads in participating in the form of governance that we have. So like most things, I tend to think of things as a trade-off, and that is the trade-off we have.
So when I talk about, so I teach students that are in communication courses, some of them are political science, but I've taken to describing American democracy repeatedly as like our current multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic democracy, aspirationally. Because even if the foundation is broken, at present, everyone is supposed to, well, current categories, but everyone has the right to vote, right? Starting at age 18, et cetera, register to vote, et cetera. You're not. And so the idea that therefore, because this is how we have set up the legal framework that we exist in today, therefore that is what we are. We are a multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic democracy. So to the extent that there are any efforts to reduce our access to the polls or certain people's access to the polls, gerrymander, or to fix things so that people have less access to the polls, it is operating antithetical to what we have decided is what we have. And my hope, especially with my first year students, like I just want them to constantly be thinking, because words matter, that this is what we live in right now. We have decided this is what we're doing. So we're either doing it or we're not. So we're doing it. If you're pushing back against that, you are operating outside of it. That this is what we are. We've decided. So that's how this is just sort of my own little anecdotal approach.
Yeah, and I mean, just to conclude, because it sounds like there's a party outside. I mean, look, I just in very like the personal terms, but also when I think about it, I think Dan and I might actually, because we have productive tension. That's one reason why I really respect things.
Thank you.
You know, look, I think a lot about how dominant groups can give up power, right? And what stories can lead people who have privilege, who've enjoyed higher status, who have enjoyed sort of the fruits of inequality, how can they come to see themselves as the products of systems that put them into those positions, right? And a theorist who I love, and I've mentioned a million times, Mahmoud Mamdani, has this idea of the survivor. And it's this idea that people are born into political systems. And yesterday's victims and yesterday's perpetrators have no choice but to live together. And therefore, it's a survivor comes responsibility. It comes responsibility in the sense that they are born into these systems, they've all experienced these systems, but they have unique responsibilities. And I think that shifts the conversation from someone like me as a white cisgendered man, from one of guilt to responsibility, that I have a set of responsibilities that are political in their fundamental nature to be reckoned with, because we were all born into these systems in various ways. And I'll end with a quote from Mamdani, because I think it's a great quote. It comes from his book, Neither Settler nor Native, which my students said a million times. But his quote is all, and he's writing about post-apartheid South Africa. His quote is, all must be born again politically. And I love that idea because it is about the fact that we are all in this together, all have shared responsibility, but some people have greater responsibility to be born again politically and to create that multiracial democracy that we're working toward. With that, thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, check us out, follow us online, Center for Information Technology and Public Life. And thanks again.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much for this.
I also want to give a huge shout out to Anna Andre, who worked all